week 11, we're counting down to the end of the semester, we will talk about a very interesting text from 1907-1908, Pekin to Paris, documenting an impossible endurance race across Asia, Eastern and Central Europe for a total of maybe approximately 10,000 miles. We don't have the exact figure covered by the cars in this race. On Thursday, I will show the conclusion and a brief scene from Traffic, the movie we watched last Thursday, just to complete your understanding of the film. And then the new film will be yet another film from 1971. I mentioned 5, and that's Le Mans by Steve McQueen, which in my mind remains the only authentic film about racing. And the best. The only authentic one because only at that time and never again after that, a production company rented actual race cars, engaged actual drivers, professional drivers, or people who belong to a category of the past called gentleman drivers, meaning people who were rich enough to afford the experience and were amateurs. And when this happened in 1971, they rented, right after the 24 Hours of Le Mans ended in June, the production took hold of the racetrack, remained there for several months, and shot every day racing scenes at speeds that were often 150 miles or more, not the real speeds, which at that point for that racetrack, which had a very long straight, exceeded 220 miles, but much closer than what you see in most films about racing. F1 with Brad Pitt did not do a bad job because they shot some of their scenes during actual qualifying and testing sessions of Formula One with cameras on their cars. But for example, even in F1 with Brad Pitt, the Apex cars, right? They have this fictional team in the film called Apex, are not even Formula One cars. They're modified Formula 3000 because, of course, a Formula One car is much more expensive. Whereas Steve McQueen, who was himself into racing, like other actors of his generation and the previous generation from James Dean on, really wanted to convey the reality of racing. So a very interesting film. Either today or at the beginning of the next class, I want to continue our group activities to introduce the procedures of the final project by engaging in an actual test of searching for short stories on the automobile. Okay? I posted an announcement because I received the confirmation from the university about the venue for the final exam. We will not be here for the final exam for whatever reason, but still in the same building. It'll be room 1023, 1023, which is in the lobby. But you can go find that in the announcement. I updated the calendar, I updated the syllabus, and you'll find also the time, the day, etc. Okay, let me get the keyboard. I forgot to prep the keyboard. Okay, so the images, the text, and the pictures, the photographs you find in today's presentation are posted under week 11, and I think I used a PDF for this. It comes from a presentation I gave on this topic, and even recently in October there was a conference about US and Italy at Stony Brook at the Center for Italian Studies, and I presented on the author of this week's book. Here you see one of the editions. This is from 1908, but the first copies were printed actually in 1907. It was kind of an instant book following the race. The race ended in August, and a few months later, the books came out in Italian, and at the same time, they were working on translations in several languages, so it came out in about 10 different languages. I myself have a first edition, slightly different from this one. The cover is different because my edition is the hardcover edition. As you can see, the original Italian title was La metà del mondo vista da un'automobile, half of the world as seen from an automobile. And then the subtitle was From Pekin to Paris. Of course, Pekin was the name of Beijing in English at that point, in 60 days, with an introduction of Prince Scipione Borghese, who was the owner and one of the drivers of the winning car for this race. The author, Luigi Barzini, a journalist, I'll show you a picture and talk to you about him, who was himself on board the car throughout the entire period. In fact, almost lost his life at some point due to a dramatic accident. He was a paying customer because his own newspaper, Corriere della Sera, saw the opportunity to sell more copies by covering this new technology being tested in this crazy endurance race across continents. And they paid 6,000 liras, which was a big amount of money. I haven't tried to see the conversion, but think tens of thousands of dollars, if not more than $100,000, so that they could publish, not every day, but almost every day, updates about the progress of the car that in fact won the race. And these articles written by Barzini initially, before he wrote the book, were also published in French and in English. They were translated, they were phoned to the offices of a French newspaper, a British newspaper, who bought the rights to publish those articles. So keep in mind the whole context, the framework, which is the automobile as a marketing opportunity. The book itself is a big marketing tool for the automobile, right? Celebrating the powers, the endurance, the reliability of a modern car. At the same time, the media are capitalizing on the attention given to technologies to sell copies of their own newspapers. Okay? So, what are the core ideas of this very interesting and very long book? The Italian edition is about 500 pages. The English edition is smaller, so even longer. The most telling quote for me for the entire book is the following, taken from a passage I'll show you later. Barzini is describing in this book, or focusing in this book, about the vertiginous delights of speed. He's talking about speed as a staple in modern life, right? The 20th century is about speed in more ways than one. It's not just fast trains or automobiles or planes. Is speed in everyday life, right? Is speed in the work environment, speed in the factory, through the assembly lines, in the commercial infrastructure, the speed with which you deliver a product to the customer, etc. And this speed is delightful, right? Is pleasant, is seen as positive, but it's also characterized as vertiginous, meaning that it produces a vertigo, that it overwhelms rationality, that it takes over your life before you even appreciate what this change is a faster life is all about. So the adjustments to the new technology in body and mind, the interaction, the physical and psychological interaction with the car is central to the book. The way the car changes the interaction with nature. You have these three people, there were three people on board, a mechanic, at the time they would call them mechanician, a mechanician/driver, Ettore, the Prince Scipione, and the journalist Luigi. These three people are going day after day across Asia and so China, Mongolia, Siberia, then Russia, then they get into Eastern Europe, Germany, and France, eventually get to Paris, and they experience the world from the automobile. Even when they stop somewhere, the interactions between the locals and the crew of the automobile are all mediated by the fact that they have this new phenomenon that they bring to parts of the world where often people would not ever seen an automobile before the passage of this car called Itala. And I have a couple of videos to show you the car, which is in a museum in Turin, but still functioning also. Symbiosis is a very important and new theme for the book, meaning it's not just the users, the passengers, the owner interacting with the vehicle. Is the body of the crew of the vehicle and the vehicle itself being fused, merging, becoming one. And this is especially exemplified through the description of the actions and the attitudes of this mechanician, Ettore Guizzardi, who seems to be able to catch through vibrations, noises, or just by looking at the car, he's able to see whether the car understand whether the car is functioning properly in healthy conditions or not, right? So the humans become an extension of the car becomes an extension of the human body, right? That's why we can call it a symbiosis. And the greatest of all the themes in the book is this idea that the circulation of more and more cars combined with other technologies such as planes and trains, will change humanity. Will change it in a Darwinian way, meaning that the humans, the individual humans, will have to adjust to a new environment, to a new natural environment, a new ecosystem inhabited by vehicles and other technologies. And there, in a pseudo popularized version of Darwinianism, there will be the survival of the fittest. And survival of the fittest for humans dealing with technologies is that only ethnic groups and communities and nations who can adjust to the use of the new technologies will survive, will manage progress, right? Spearhead progress. And of course, there is a colonialist attitude, right? Where progress, industrial progress, is identified with the West. And the East is the passive recipient of this technological intrusion and soon to be forced to adapt, even if they might not choose to. They even talk about the bureaucratic hurdles they have to go through to be authorized to operate the vehicles in China. Imperial China in 1907 was governed by an oligarchy. Under the emperor, there was a committee, and the committee actually functioned as a government. And they were skeptical, suspicious, not of these foreigners, but especially of their technologies. Okay. So I've mentioned this idea that human evolution, the natural path of human evolution, is about to change, to be impacted by the technologies, right? So it's a very new way of looking at things, right? Evolution goes from a natural thing to a transhuman thing, because technology affects human evolution, the biological, the psychological evolution of humans. So I've mentioned Darwin already, this idea that the principles expounded by Darwin in reference to animals can be applied to humans in societies, where the society, the complexity of the social circumstances surrounding humans replaces nature itself, right? So that's where the survival of the fittest happens for humans in society, where progress means that individuals who are more mobile in society, more successful, will replicate more often, to simplify the concept. Lombroso, if you're not familiar, I may have mentioned his name earlier in the semester, was one of the founders of modern criminology, an Italian criminologist from northern Italy who followed a scientific approach to the examination of crime and criminals. More specifically, one of his regular practices was to go to jails and to military bases with the authorization of the local and national authorities to measure criminals, measure their bodies, and study them, study their psychology, their psyche. His goal was twofold. One, provide scientific data for a group that he saw as a subspecies, so to speak, in human society. He thought that criminals were criminals for a reason that had to be biological and psychological. So he wanted, as a scientist, approach this from a material point of view, provide data, right? He would measure, again, height, the measure of the bones in the body. He would study the spine, anything he could. And this for male inmates, female inmates, and he wrote books on both that were translated immediately in English. The other objective he had, which was quite ambitious, but in line with this idea that modern society have to be engineered, have to be planned carefully, was that he thought, if I can identify the physical and psychological characteristic of a criminal, of someone who was born in a Darwinian sense with that inclination, then I can go back to society, measure people before their adult age, before they become criminal, performing active crimes, and I can isolate those potential criminals and make them into regular citizens, abiding by the laws, or I can set them aside, isolate them from society, shield society from their criminal actions before they appear. I don't know if you've ever seen, at this point, it's old for your generation, there used to be a film with Tom Cruise, Minority Report, based on the same idea that there are powerful minds in a future dystopian society able to identify future crimes, and therefore people are being pursued by the authorities before they commit any crime to stop them. But this clearly makes for dangerous discrimination. Now, this idea that within the human species there would be subgroups goes beyond race, right? Of course, there was a racial view of the world at that point. But the idea was that every ethnic group, even within race, every social class, every role in society matched the natural profile of an individual. That is to say, in other words, Lombroso and others were convinced that when you study 100 people, a sample of society, you should find that most of them do what they do in life not because of their circumstances. They were born poor, they didn't receive an education. No, they do what they do because there is a balance in nature, there is a balance in society. The balance in society, and I'm thinking some of this echoes the earliest theories of Jordan Peterson, if you're familiar. But again, before Jordan became famous for his anti-work positions, the idea that the natural balance in society, or the natural hierarchy of humans, is predicated on the actual natural, physical, and psychological qualities of an individual. That in modern society, most people at the top have the qualities for natural leadership. And most people at the bottom, at the very bottom of society, have no qualities to advance. In fact, the discussion based on these principles generated incredible ideas from our viewpoint, such as you shouldn't have mass education. Education should not be made affordable to everyone in society, because there are people who are destined to be just peasants, just carpenters, just porters. To mention an example from Lombroso, he went to, I think, Bergamo and studied porters, the men who carried heavy loads, based, again, on the premise that he thought he would find it demonstrated by his study that someone who works as a porter has a different body, a different attitude, was made by nature for that, to perform that role in society. Okay? Yes?
So it's kind of similar to like a caste system, per se?
Similar to?
Like a caste system?
Classism?
Oh, no, caste system.
Isn't that India?
A caste system. Not even. In a way more dangerous, because a caste system can be inherited from a traditional condition of unfairness, right? Again, you're born into a caste and you can elevate yourself beyond the condition of your own family. In here, the idea is that some people from the lower classes will be mobile, will advance. Hector, the mechanician, is used as an example. He comes from a lower class, but through his mechanical skills, he's destined to go up in the class system. But at the same time, at some point, you reach a situation of balance, right? Where everyone in society more or less reaches its natural limit and would not be able to advance even if you gave them a university degree or a post-bachelor degree to adjust the example to our models. Okay? So that it was in many ways a weird and dangerous ideology, right? Again, keep in mind that Darwin's books, starting with The Origin of the Species, had a great impact. It was like a Copernican revolution, right? Like going in the Renaissance, going from the idea that the Earth is at the center and the sun and the stars rotate around it, to the understanding that it's the opposite. And the same happened with Darwin. And they didn't know what to do when it came to the view of society and social dynamics. And they applied those theories in a very crude way. And some of those theories morphed into the theories, the racial ideas of fascism and National Socialism in Italy and Germany, for example. The author of this book himself, Barzini, at the end of his life and career, he ended up working for a press agency supporting Mussolini's republic at the end of the war in northern Italy in 1944 and 45, because he was moving intellectually along similar lines. And when the war finished, Barzini was tried, accused of being a collaborator, a staunch supporter of fascism, and lost its reputation, his wealth. He died a few years after the war. a failed man in many ways, right? So another short set of concepts, and then we'll move to the pictures and have a visual of the actual race. The modality of the world means that when it comes to technologies, the relationship between users and technologies, technological devices, is not simply an evolution of the way you would use a plow, a cart with wheels, a hammer in the past. No. Interacting with technology is the new modality, is life. And of course, it's easy for us to understand, right? Because we've reached the culmination of that process with smartphones, where most people never get too far from their smartphone. They have it with them. They might have it in their bed at night. And if not, they'll have it on the nightstand turned on, right? And most younger people cannot even conceive of being disconnected from technology, disconnected from the internet, etc. That's the culmination of this process. Living with technology as a modality, as the modus operandi of life, right? I've described this idea of the new ecosystem, new mindset, right? A new way of looking at everything, a new culture, and of course, a new language as well. And here it is, the Itala that won the race from Beijing to Paris, being photographed by Barzini, who brought a camera with him and took a lot of pictures, which are one of the most interesting elements of this book. And through the picture, we'll have a sense also of his way of looking at what they did. But you can see that it's really a big car, right? Let me show you the characters first. Here on this side, the shorter man is Ettore Guizzardi, and I'll talk about his life. But essentially, he was the trusted collaborator, assistant of the prince, the owner of the car, during this and many other trips. And he was considered a mechanical prodigy, somebody who had a deep understanding of the automotive technology, had learned also, had studied in several settings. And behind this pile of stuff, you see the head of the prince coming out. Of course, you see the Italian flag because, as I mentioned, there is this colonialist mindset driving this operation. The car is big and heavy. We don't have exact figures, but possibly a couple of tons, 4,500 pounds. You can see some of the tanks. Here there is a tank, there is one here, and there is another one on the other side. Big tanks to carry stupendous amounts of gasoline. This was a heavy car, probably went only a few miles with a gallon, surely less than 10 miles. But more importantly, they're going through Asia and Russia. They're not going to 5 gas stations. In fact, one of the reasons why they won the race is that the prince was better organized than the other crews. He shipped in advance of the race gasoline, oil for lubrication, spare tires to locations across the entire itinerary. So they knew that every few hundred miles, they would find new tires, gasoline to refuel, and other supplies. So I don't remember exactly the size of the side tanks, but they must have been 100 gallons or more each. The rest of the stuff you see in here was also things like tents and other items, because they would often just camp by the side of the car. They would drive 8, 10, 12 hours a day, camp by the side of the car. Once in a while, especially when they stopped to refuel, they would sleep in some place in a village or be offered hospitality, because at some point they became famous. It became a global ordeal. People were waiting for the cars to come, and so they would be invited to dinner and to spend the night at the house of upper class members of Russian society, for example. The planks were used to cross paddles, stretches of dirt roads with mud, or to cross small fords, right? And they had other tools with them. Exactly here, where you see this pile of stuff, this is where the car, as you sit in Turin nowadays in the museum, this is where the third passenger seat was. So the journalist was supposed to be sitting behind them, but there was never any space. So we know from the book that Barzini would just sit here and put his foot on this side step, but he would then get tired in that position, and the risk was that he would fall off the car. That didn't happen, luckily, but he had another accident where he hit his head on rocks. What else? We can estimate, of course, there was no speedometer. We can estimate the speed of the car to be, the top speed to be about 50 miles. But the conditions of the road prevented the car from driving at that speed most of the time. Okay? And I think that should be enough for the details. Other than that, of course, this picture is one of the symbolic representations of the novelty of this race. Because at this point, there are no roads that are made for a car of this weight in this area between Siberia and Russia. And so they asked permission to drive on the railroad tracks. They stop at a station, make their request. The station officer has to convey the request to the Ministry of Transportation to get authorization to stop the trains and allow them on the tracks. But since Prince Scipione, the owner of the car, was a cosmopolitan aristocrat, somebody connected to aristocracy in Russia, in Germany, in France, they give them permission, stop the trains for a few hours, and they go across this stretch of territory on the tracks. But this becomes then symbolic of the car replacing or competing with the train, right? Which used to be the king of modern transportation, of modern mobility. This is the prince. As we read in the cover, the book says the introduction was written by the prince. In fact, I believe the introduction was written by Barzini. The style betrays that. And as a homage to the prince, he put his name under that. And more than probably, he discussed the contents of the introduction with the prince. To begin with, as you will see, the introduction has this strong statement at the beginning. If you ask me if one can drive on an automobile from Beijing to Paris, the answer is no. And we'll see why not. So they admit that it was only a partial success for reasons that will be clear in a moment. But the prince, the owner of the car and one of the drivers, is one of the figures in the book that becomes the prototype of the new man. For one thing, in a Darwinian sense, he is seen as an example of natural aristocracy. Somebody who is a leader not just because his family goes back to the Middle Ages, they had popes in their genealogical tree, but because he has the natural qualities, the biological and psychological qualities to be a leader. Speaks several languages, he's agile and strong physically, he's a doer, right? He's somebody who's a pragmatic leader. And a thinker. You see him reading the newspaper, meaning someone who can reflect on the automobile and understand the commercial and possibly the military implications of the deployment of this technology. The next character is still from the book, Ettore Guizzardi, who was quite a few years younger than the prince. The prince, in fact, died in the 1920s, and Guizzardi died in the 1960s. And up until the end of his life, journalists or regular people would visit his house in northern Italy, asking him to tell the stories about this race. So in the book, you will see that Ettore was the son of a locomotive engineer. He was riding the train with his father about the age of 10 or 11 in central Italy, and the train derailed. It was a horrible accident. His father died. Other people died or were wounded, passengers on the train. They needed to take these passengers to some place, and nearby there was a villa, one of many villas owned by the Borghese family. That's how Scipione met Ettore as a kid. And this story becomes an allegory of the birth of the new man, because Ettore was born to life once from his mother's womb, and the second time was born out of the locomotive, out of this catastrophe. The machine gave him a second life, because once he met the prince took him under his wing. He saw that by riding the train with his father, he had already become familiar with mobile technologies, and the prince took him with him in automobile rides, sent him to study automotive technologies and mechanics at Fiat, at the Fiat factory first, and then people were drafted in the army at that time. So he served in the army in a mechanical unit. So the idea is that even someone from the lower classes, such as Ettore, can have mobility, social mobility in a society where technology, familiarity with technology, fluency with the new language of life gives you a chance to express your talents. So he too is the prototype for the new man of the future on the lower end of the social spectrum. And then you find the journalist. He looks even younger than he was. He was born in 1874. At 26, he landed a prestigious job with the top newspaper in Italy, Corriere della Sera. And he made a career out of being a foreign correspondent in a new way. The new ideas for a foreign correspondent, elaborated by him and his director, the newspaper director Albertini, were the following. A foreign correspondent must really go deep, immerse himself in the context of the area where he's reported. In fact, before the race, he had been to Morocco, he had been to the United States. For example, the following year, 1908, Barzini will spend the whole year practically in the United States. And the second principle of the new role for the foreign correspondent was the foreign correspondent has to be in the thick of action. If there is a battle, if there is a war, if there is a catastrophe, he has to report from there. So, for example, when there was the earthquake of Messina at the end of 1908, an earthquake in Sicily that might have killed 100,000 people, he was in the US, and immediately he was ordered to take a ship and go to Sicily. And from Sicily, he stayed in Sicily 4 weeks at the site of the earthquake. He covered that event. Later on, in April of that year, 1909, we find him on a train going to Turkey because there is an insurrection that is threatening to upset the Ottoman Empire, right? So he has to be there to witness it all. And this is what he did with the automobile. Of course, as you can see here, he was more of an intellectual than a practical man. But he put himself in all kinds of circumstances, was very ambitious, and thought that a good journalist would be close to the elite, because a good government should operate better by relying on factual information, especially technical information provided by good journalists. So he's not covering, for example, in 1908, he's in New York covering the construction of the East River tunnels for what is now the Long Island Railroad. And those were very modern construction sites. Imagine having to dig a tunnel under the East River in 1909. And he's documenting all the technologies employed to construct those tunnels, right? The idea being that based on his articles, one day even Italians might be able to do something similar. And this is how the idea of the race came out. Not from Barzini's newspaper, but from a French newspaper called Le Matin. And you can appreciate what kind of modern newspaper this is. The title, the subtitle, and underneath the Le Matin is The Last Telegrams of the Night, meaning this is a newspaper based on the freshest news coming very quickly through the telegraph. And to emphasize this, what you see here is a telegraph pole, right? Telegraph poles of that time had multiple wires. And a newspaper like this, from this point, is just 4 pages, right? And you just open it and read it. So being on the first page for a 4-page journal is quite something. And here is the first page. They say the Paris to Pekin automobile, a producer's challenge. The initial idea was to have a race starting from Paris, going to Beijing. Why did they change the itinerary, making it even more difficult for the participants? Based on sales. Because they knew that if the race ended in Paris, they could sell newspapers and merchandise, which they did. By the time the Itala car with the Italian crew got to Paris, hundreds of thousands of people were waiting for them. And they were being sold postcards with images of the car, newspapers, booklets, etc. Okay? So in this article, they're saying, we want to organize this race, we will cover it as a newspaper, and this race, this very long race, will show the progress made by the technology of the automobile. Then they change. They decide to start for Beijing, and only later they realize that participants dropped from a few dozens to only 5. Because, of course, in order to start the race from Beijing, you had to ship the car and supplies to Beijing, which would be very expensive for the participants. The only reason why the race still took place was that once it looked like the race could be canceled, the prince, who had already ordered a custom-made car, the car you saw was custom-made according to his requests, the prince said, it doesn't matter, if you don't do it, I'll do it by myself. And his name carried so much prestige that they put the race back on. This is, again, from Barzini. So Le Matin is publishing Barzini's article. This is June 9th, 1907, the day before they started the race, right? So again, through our special wires, constant references to the telegraph, dispatches of the night, the race from Beijing to Paris, the last preparations, and they're about to start. And notice, just to give you a sense of the relevance of this, next to it, another article on the second peace conference of Le Hague, which was the second edition of a tremendously important peace conference, international conference, following conflicts such as the war between Japan and Russia, to curb armaments for example, limit the number of warships built by countries, and regulate warfare, right? And they're next to each other in terms of importance. This is the next day, still le matin, ils sont partis, they have departed, right? The cars are on their way to Paris, and then they have different subtitles and images of the 5 participants. Again, they were down to 5 participants. One of them used a tricycle because they thought the roads are terrible, they're very muddy, a tricycle being lighter will not sink and get stuck in mud. In fact, they withdrew from the race. They were the first one to leave the race. And then they have a few bigger cars. Here you have the Italian car, the Itala. Yeah, and they list 2,000 kilos for that, so 4,400 pounds. And a power of 40 HP, which is a fraction of what you have on any car, even the smallest. They had 2 French cars, a Belgian car, and the Belgian car itself has a story to it because the driver was a trickster who got supplies, promising sponsorships, and sold the spare parts to make money himself. When he got to Europe, he was arrested for fraud. This is the itinerary. You find Pekin, Beijing here, Manchuria, and then you find Lake Baikal, Siberia, Russia, and then you see Moscow, and you don't even see, but clearly this is the smaller part of the voyage going to Paris through Germany. Here you find Cologne. It looks like a highway. It looks almost like a straight line. In fact, the reality was different. The book has an entire map inside. Here you can see how many deviations were made. Why these deviations? Mostly to be as close as possible to telegraph stations so that they would be able to send out articles via telegraph. And the biggest deviation of them all is here from Moscow to St. Petersburg instead of going straight, simply because at this point, the winning car, Itala, had an advantage of several days, and they were invited in St. Petersburg, where the prince had Russian friends, Russian aristocrats, and they went in there to celebrate the automobile because they knew that even by deviating, they would still be winning the race. By the time they got to Germany, people were lining up along the streets or the roads. People were following them with cars. They risked various accidents because people wanted to join this parade. And again, the Itala won not because it was the fastest, and there were faster cars in races at that time. It was just the most robust, a vehicle able to go through roads that were often rudimentary or non-existent. This is an example. They go visit this telegraph office run by a Chinese man and his daughter is with him, where Barzini will send an article to Europe. And they're asked to leave their name on the register, the log of the office, and they see that they're the first person to send out a telegram from there. Why? Well, simply because in order to have telegrams going from Beijing to Paris, along the telegraph lines, the signal, the electric signal would decay. So every few hundred miles, there should be a station receiving messages and then telegraphing those messages to the next, relaying those messages to the next station. That's why no one from this area ever sent a telegram before Barzini, because all they did was relay the traffic of information to the next telegraph station. What's striking to me when I look at the pictures, at the many pictures in this book, is that they're not just pictures of the automobile. They're often just pictures of the people along the road. Because there is this idea of the anthropological revolution, meaning what will happen to these people when their context, their reality will be invaded by commercial vehicles, by other technologies, the phone, the telegraph, etc. Right? That's the idea. He's studying them as much as they are observing him. He's trying to understand how, in a Darwinian mindset, how they will be adjusting. Will they be able to adjust? Are they afraid of the automobile? When they look at a photographic camera, what's their attitude, right? And it's a documentation of all the races they encounter, all the ethnic groups, all the genders and classes. Of course, you can see from here the conditions of the roads, right? Even within a town or a village in Russia or Siberia, they don't really find a road made for a big vehicle such as this one. And again, you see the regular setup of the car with all the supplies in the back, and Ettore is at the wheel. Of course, the steering wheel is on the right because there was no standard at this point. Even in Italy, some vehicles were built with the steering on the left, others on the right. Even circulation was not standardized. Even within Italy, some regions you had to drive on the left, other regions on the right. The standards came much later. And of course, you see people coming out to see the automobile, right? Now, you've seen the automobile complete, but when they're about to leave, this is how the automobile looked like. That is to say, they removed as much weight from the automobile as possible because they knew that right after they left Beijing, they would encounter different conditions. So they removed most of the tanks, they removed the supplies, the seats, right? You can see that Ettore here is sitting on a crate, on a wooden crate. They're trying to make the car as light as possible. Engine, chassis, the big wheels. By the way, these wheels were made of wood, the spokes, right? Because right after they left Beijing, this is what they found. And the prince, who was well organized, won the race because, for example, for a few hundreds of miles outside of Beijing, he had engaged groups of porters, the Chinese porters were called coolies at that time, to pull the car through these muddy or narrow roads. So it was all human strength, right? And you see the prince standing on the car like the captain of a ship, right? Ordering the Chinese. There is a man here pushing the car, right? But again, you can see that the conditions of the road are quite peculiar. And they made no mystery. That's why at the beginning of the introduction, they say, is it possible to drive a car from Beijing to Paris? No, because you couldn't just use a car all the way. Without these men pulling the car, they would not have been able to make it. And other times they didn't drive. And again, they made no mystery. They documented everything in the book. Look at this small mountain pass. This is the actual road, right? You can see the ruts left by the carts, right? Because the carts were able to navigate these roads better than this big vehicle. And once again, you see the prince sitting princely on top of the car, and these poor men pushing and pulling this car through this pass, right? And this went on for days and days during the initial part of the race. Again, here, for example, you see our motor power among the rocks of the Kimini. And they document everything. They want to show the reality of this race. And you can see how many of these porters were required to pull this big car. But these were men working as porters. Again, throughout the world, there were large numbers of humans working just in this kind of profession to carry loads in different settings, especially urban settings. And this is what they meet when they traverse Asia, right? They find carts with camels that practically represent the Silk Road that existed from the time of Marco Polo, before Marco Polo, to later times, meaning the car is a big revolution in this place. And here you have another symbolic picture. The car going in one direction and big animals pulling these carts in the opposite direction. Of course, one is the future, the other is the past. One is about to disappear, the other is about to become prominent. Near Urga, carts of the past and carts of the future, reads the caption. This is where the race might have ended, and Barzini's life as well. They go across this wooden bridge built by the Russian army, by the engineers of the Russian army, during the war between Russia and Japan in 1904-1905. And it was not made for heavy vehicles. So they go across this bridge very slowly. They know that these bridges are not to be trusted. When they're in the middle, though, the planks crash and the car remains like this, as you can see. But here you have rocks. There was a brook in here. So Barzini is thrown onto the rocks, hits his head, must have had a head trauma for sure. The prince wants to leave him in a hospital. He says, no, I want to continue. And he will continue. The car itself was so sturdy, so robust, that it survived. So they just pulled it out, put it on the road, and turned the engine on and continued. You can see here how they managed. The prince, among other languages, spoke some Russian because he had many friends in the Russian aristocracy. So he spoke to local peasants. They called other people. They were promised money. They were traveling with cash. And they used pulleys and ropes to pull the car back onto the road, this huge car. And again, there was no structural damage to the car in spite of the circumstances. At this point, the bridge has been taken apart or has fallen as they pull the car up. Of course, even though they were traveling in June, July, and early August, some of the areas of Siberia were still cold, and they had to protect themselves from the dirt, the dust, the pebbles with these kind of heavy, long coats, right? They're in open-top cars, so they have to cover themselves like that. They make no mystery of the fact that the car is too heavy and they sink in mud all the time. This is one example, and every time people come to help them. Here they're sunk again, still in Siberia, and you can see again their heavy clothes. Sunk again. If you look here, you know that they're stuck. And people are happy to be photographed. At this point, people know about this global event. So they think they're on a stage. They think they're being pictured for a world audience. People surrounding the car, another symbolic photograph, because it reflects the question in the book. How will these people manage once an automobile will be required to exist, right? And it's normal for us, right? Unless you live in an urban setting, you assume that you need an automobile, that you'll not be able to work and function in life without one, for example, in a place such as this one, Stony Brook, Long Island. But it was a new question at this point, with very few cars in a place such as this. And the answer is positive by Barzini. Barzini finds that most people show acceptance of this new technology. They're willing to embrace this technology for the most part, with some exceptions. Again, they don't hide the fact that in here, for example, instead of driving, they go across a lake with a ferry. So in some ways they cheated in a small way, but it's fine. It was not a race in the traditional sense. And again, they're surrounded by a crowd. They're a media event. They're a big community event at this point. sunk again outside a city in Siberia called Irkutsk. And you can compare the lighter cart. This is much lighter. So it's not sinking, not because of the narrow wheels, it should be the opposite, but because this cart is much lighter than this heavy automobile. And this is what happens to them. They get to Irkutsk and they're invited to dinner by the bourgeoisie of the town. And they meet this guy called Radionov, and he wants to drive the car with them. It's his first automobile ride. And this is a test about humanity versus the future. So what happens, the brief description of the reaction by Radionov. Keep in mind that there was another test earlier where a Chinese governor tested the car and he was frightened by the car and not at all ready. The opposite happens to this Russian or Siberian merchant. Radionov, who was now being initiated for the first time, notice the language, initiation, right? Anthropological or religious, into the inebriating joys of velocity. This is a somewhat loose translation. This is what I would translate literally as the vertiginous delights of speed, was uttering cries of wonder and enthusiasm. His reaction is physical, right? Not mental in the first place. At every longer flight of the car, meaning stretches where the car sped up, he fervently, again, religious message, language, initiated biological message, in this case, inebriating, fervently reaffirmed his intention to get a motor himself. And here you can see what we discussed for the novel A Motor Car Divorce, this connection between technologies and consumption. You see the technology, you want one. And what is modern, though, about this? He should have one at once. This idea, which is very modern, that if I want something, I want it right away. And compare this all the way to 100 years later, early 2000, people camping out of an Apple store for days to be the first one to get a smartphone, the new Apple phone, the new iPhone, right? He would order it as soon as he got back home. He would telegraph for one. So the plan is for him to send a telegraph to Itala factory in Italy to order one to be shipped to him. He would have one identically like ours, right? This idea of modern consumption. And then he gets out a sandwich, he gives sandwiches to the entire crew and they eat and they're merry. This is how Le Matin presented their arrival at Irkutsk, the same city. Look, they're using the globe. This is a global event, and you can very much see that from the illustration. They want to place it, right? This is where they are. This is the journey, the part of the journey they've covered. And this is the rest they still have to travel, right? And you can see it even better here. And this is one in a small series I've excerpted of Barzini taking pictures of every ethnic group along the way, not just for to document races, but as a background to his reflection. What will happen to people who made their existence with horses, such as this man, when horses will be outdated and replaced by automobiles? Will he survive in a Darwinian sense or go extinct, become marginal in society? And he was a Kyrgyz. Here you see a Mongolian family. Looking at them, looking at Barzini and the car. You see women from Russia, right? It's not just ethnic groups, it's genders, it's classes. And this is the reaction of the people in one of the passages. First, the reaction of the people to the car passing by. Some express the greatest surprise. They seem stunned and let their tools fall from their hands in their astonishment. It's a miracle, right? It's a marvel. Others ran gaily to look at the car, as a crowd runs to look at some harmless but strange phenomenon, or at a troupe of itinerant mountebanks, acrobats, circus people. A few fled. But when we stopped, this is a good test of future humanity, future evolution. Everyone was reassured and approached us, and a moment later they would treat both ourselves and our car with the most friendly familiarity. So they're well disposed towards the new technology. The younger generation, the future, admiring the machine and putting very pertinent questions to us concerning its speed and strength. The Itala, the car, was the goal of an innocent and fantastic pilgrimage, again using religious language to intimate that the car is the new idol, the new god in modern society. All the crowd stood round with respectful admiration as before a sacred mystery. Technology is the new cult, the new religion of modern society. This is the translation. The English translation, as I said, there were many others, bears the year of 1907, but it's not clear that copies were distributed and sent to bookstore before the first months of 1908. And you see the title is slightly different, just Pekin to Paris. 1907 is when a lot of books about the automobile come out. This is another fundamental essay by an Italian intellectual and journalist, Il nuovo aspetto meccanico del mondo, the new mechanical or aspect look of the world, published by the same author in Milan, the same editor who published Pekin to Paris. And again, Morasso is saying technologies bring speed, speed and technologies bring a revolution that is anthropological. Human society, humans in general, will never be the same. French newspapers were still publishing vignettes such as this one about motor romance, right? The car as a catalyst for relationships. 1907, they published this play that we read in Automobile. And 1908, just the following year, they published the sonnets about the automobile. Between 1907 and 1908, in Italy, they published this book called In Automobile about tourism made new by the use of the automobile, with an interesting chapter at the end called Friends and Enemies of the Automobile, with this idea from the same book that the driver is a new kind of human, right? You can see, since the goggles erase his gaze, you can see that he's transformed, that he's a new kind of human living in a symbiotic relationship with the automobile. And here they are again. This is one of the best views of the automobile without supplies, but you can appreciate the third seat, never used by passenger, rarely. The two big tanks of gasoline, smaller tank of either oil or water, and the various instrumentation on the dashboard. And here too, they're interacting with people from Mongolia. Thank you. And here is a passage testifying to the ideas that speed means Western world and speed means progress. And of course, it's a very colonialist view. This is when they're finally able to send the car at full speed. We feel the pride of a civilization and a race. The civilization of Europe overshadows us. It is resumed and symbolized by the speed of our flight, the great longings of the Western soul, its strength, the true secret of all its progress, is resumed, meaning summarized in a short word: faster speed. Our life is pursued by this violent desire, meaning a desire that overwhelms us, this painful insatiability, this sublime obsession: faster.